Aegon Targaryen was only a boy when he first learned that everything he had known, his name, his purpose, his very identity, had been a carefully guarded secret. The day he was told that he was not young Griff but Aegon Targaryen, trueborn son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Elia Martell, it seemed to him as though a second sunrise had blossomed in his mind. Light flooded all those corners of his childhood that had dwelled in twilight. Suddenly, the careful training in arms, the cloistered life at sea, and the lessons in history, philosophy, and courtly behavior made sense in ways they never had before. He was a prince in exile. He was the rightful heir to the Iron Throne, if only he could seize it. In truth, it was Jon Connington who recognized, first and foremost, the weight that the boy would come to bear. Connington would watch him quietly in the candlelit gloom of a ship's cabin, or on the rolling deck under a blazing sun, appraising him as one might appraise the edge of a newly forged sword. Every step in the boy's life had been deliberate, every influence carefully selected, every lesson meticulously designed. The weight was tremendous, but it was the destiny that so many who loved Rhaegar Targaryen wished upon him. Aegon grew with each passing day into that role. He took to the sword eagerly, practicing with the men-at-arms until his shoulders burned and his legs trembled from exhaustion. He studied histories of Aegon the Conqueror and his sisters, how they had united the 7 kingdoms under the Targaryen banner. He learned from texts about the duty of a king, the art of diplomacy, and the intricacies of Westerosi politics. All this he bore with a stoicism unusual for one so young, shaped by Connington's stern guidance and the more subtle influences of the Syvas-loving, wise Septa Lemore, and of the half-remembered dreams that stared back at him from the pages describing his father, the legendary Rhaegar. In time, their ship reached the shores of the Stormlands. Allies were courted, old companions quietly corresponded with Jon Connington, and under cover of darkness, Aegon Targaryen set foot on Westerosi soil for the first time since he was a babe, carried away amidst blood and fire during the sack of King's Landing. From that moment, the hidden prince dedicated every fiber of his being to reclaiming that which he believed was rightfully his, the Iron Throne. For months, rumors spread of the Golden Company's landing in the Stormlands, whispers carried by travelers and merchants who noted that large numbers of mercenaries had appeared near Griffin's Roost. Old loyalties were stirred, for many houses of the Stormlands had turned fractious after Robert Baratheon's death and the subsequent chaos that rippled across the kingdom. While Tommen Baratheon, young, sweet Tommen, wore the crown in King's Landing, no child ruled alone. In truth, it was Cersei Lannister who held the strings, along with a fractured small council that seemed more intent on their own survival than on forging any lasting peace. The War of the Five Kings had already left the land scarred. Many lords hungered for stability as starving men hunger for bread. The Lannisters had fought to secure their hold on the throne, but every conflict had chipped away at their power. Tywin Lannister's death had removed the keystone in a grand arch. Though Kevan Lannister tried to prop up the realm, the ambitions of Cersei burned too brightly for stability to truly thrive. When rumors came that a Targaryen prince had landed, one who commanded the storied Golden Company, the news created fresh ripples of possibility. Some houses in the Stormlands recalled the memory of Rhaegar Targaryen with reverence and regret. Rhaegar had been beloved, admired, even by those who had followed Robert to war. So many had not marched for hatred of the Targaryens. They had marched for the love of Robert Baratheon, for their own oaths, or simply because the times demanded it. But if this new Targaryen was truly Rhaegar's son, legitimate and well-prepared by loyal hands, would it not be wise to at least consider his claim? Jon Connington, reinstated as the Lord of Griffin's Roost and eager to wash away the dishonor of his earlier disgrace under King Aerys, worked tirelessly to gather local support. The Golden Company advanced in neat columns, stamping the roads with thousands of iron feet. They moved from castle to castle, forging alliances. Some houses resisted at first, unwilling to risk the wrath of the Iron Throne. But as ravens flew and letters were read, more bent the knee to Aegon Targaryen, 6th of his name, than might have been expected. The youth's sincerity, his aura of quiet confidence, and the promise of the Targaryen restoration compelled them. The boy did not simply march at the head of an army. He visited local townsfolk under discreet guard, distributing the Golden Company's abundant food stores as a gesture of kindness in a war-ravaged land. He walked among them dressed in plain traveling clothes, forging an image of a princeling who cared for the small folk. Combined with his martial training and the powerful presence of Connington at his side, Aegon's efforts slowly, gently turned hearts. Here was a Targaryen who had not scorched the countryside with dragons, who did not bear the cruelty whispered of King Aerys, nor the aloof air of the old Targaryen kings. He was young and, by many accounts, earnest. In King's Landing, the rumors grew more difficult to ignore. Cersei's fury mounted with each new piece of news about some Stormlord bending the knee to this pretender. Yet the Lannisters had more immediate problems. A measure of conflict with the Tyrells simmered, for Margaery Tyrell had married King Tommen, creating a delicate dance of power with the Queen of Thorns, Lady Olenna, in the wings. The crown's coffers were drained. Then there was the Faith, newly militant, casting a suspicious gaze at the Queen Regent's every maneuver. The north was in upheaval, the Iron Islands in rebellion, and Dorne smoldered with vengeance in its heart. Elia Martell's murder had never been forgotten. By the time the Golden Company threatened the gates of Storm's End, crowning Aegon in the eyes of many Stormlanders, the boy had grown surer of himself. Storm's End was a stronghold of House Baratheon, but it had never recognized Tommen wholly, for Stannis was the rightful lord of the castle in name. However, with Stannis parted northward on his own campaign, and many of his forces broken or scattered, Storm's End had spent months in uncertain hands. The garrison, uncertain and short-supplied, faced the Golden Company from within thick walls, battered by the winds off Shipbreaker Bay. Rather than attempt a savage siege, Aegon's advisors called parley with the Castellan and those few knights loyal to House Baratheon still in Storm's End. It was an unprecedented move for a Sellsword army. There was usually coin to be made in taking a castle by force. But Connington was no mere mercenary commander, and Aegon was no mercenary captain's son. The Targaryen prince offered terms that included confirming the garrison's leadership in their offices. No forced quartering, no rapine, and no sacking. He offered a promise. Lay down arms, open the gates, and they would be spared. And in exchange, they would serve the rightful king. And the gates opened. Word of that swift, almost bloodless victory raced across Westeros. For Storm's End was not a place easily taken. With so little blood spilled, the capture of that fortress seemed to some a sign of destiny. Even more important, it gave the Golden Company a secure base in the Stormlands, a point from which to strike outward. Ravens continued to fly. Now, the question whispered among courtiers in King's Landing was whether the Crown would mount an immediate response. Could they? The Crown was not what it had been. Jaime Lannister's attempt to bring peace to the Riverlands and hold House Frey in check was a draining endeavor. The Crown's own armies had been whittled away by war after war. Through every corridor of the Red Keep, one could feel the tension. Pycelle was dead, Qyburn's influence spread ghost-like through the castle, and Cersei's restless nights were filled with nightmares that a Targaryen soared back to claim his birthright. She had once believed the rumor of Daenerys Targaryen across the Narrow Sea as her greatest threat. But now, a Targaryen was already in Westeros, and not a mere rumored boy of uncertain parentage. This one had the largest and most disciplined Sellsword company in the known world at his back. Despite the swirl of fear, many at court mocked Aegon as a mummer's dragon. Varys had once planted seeds about a Targaryen offspring spirited away after the sack of King's Landing. Tales had always circulated, from Myr to Lys, about the possibility. Yet no one truly believed it, or they had not wanted to. Cersei clung to her scorn even as her worry grew. She believed this boy had to be a Blackfyre pretender or some up-jumped child with dyed hair. Still, the threat of him commanded her attention. She pressed the small council to raise new forces, to coordinate a response. But the gold dragons in the treasury were all but gone, and the City Watch, bolstered, yes, but mostly untested in true warfare, would not be enough for open battle. The Lannisters counted on forces from the Westerlands, but after years of war, even that region was drained. Panic led to mistakes. Cersei demanded that Kevan Lannister scramble to gather an army. She insisted that Qyburn find ways to hamper the Golden Company's progress, either by sabotage or infiltration. And soon, shipments of wildfire were rumored to be moved from the Guildhall of the Alchemists, as if the shadow of her father's old strategy during the sack lingered in Cersei's mind. The notion that King's Landing could be threatened so swiftly stoked her paranoia. She pictured a second field of fire, or a new sack of the city, and it filled her with equal parts terror and fury. Meanwhile, Aegon advanced methodically. Cunnington sent envoys to House Tarth and other lesser Stormland houses, securing more alliances. Each success fed Aegon's confidence. The boy had started to carry himself like a king, though he was by no means arrogant. He spent time in council with the officers of the Golden Company, reading reports and learning the art of war. When a messenger arrived with the news that the crown was mustering an army near King's Landing, Aegon gathered his own men with an eagerness that reminded Cunnington of Rhaegar. In the quiet of Storm's End's great hall, the boy turned to Cunnington with shining eyes. "We will not stay idle behind stone walls," Aegon declared. "We must move. Every moment we linger, our enemies will say we cower. Let us prove them wrong." Cunnington allowed a faint smile. "As your grace commands," he said. That was the first time, in the presence of the lords and captains, that he called Aegon by a kingly address. The Golden Company marched northward. Lords who had turned cloak from the Baratheon cause found themselves faced with a new decision. Bend the knee to a Targaryen or hold to the boy King Tommen, a Lannister in all but name. Some who had old ties to House Martell remembered Elaya's tragic end and were quietly moved. Meanwhile, Dorne watched from afar, uncertain whether to support this new Targaryen, or to keep its focus on Daenerys Targaryen across the sea, or perhaps to remain aloof until the fruit was ripe to be plucked. The Lords of the Reach were entangled with the Lannisters through marriage, but they had begun to resent Cersei's endless demands. News trickled in of the Golden Company's strict discipline on the march. No raping, no looting, no burning of fields. Their cells words carried themselves more like honorable knights than the cutthroats the people had expected. This, too, endeared them to small folk along the road. Each day, crowds emerged from huts and holdfasts, bearing little offerings of bread or fruit to the quiet, violet-eyed boy who rode at the fore beneath a banner of the three-headed dragon. Not all the Golden Company's path was lined with welcomes. Bands of brigands, opportunistic outlaws, and occasionally Lannister-aligned skirmishers harassed them. Yet each time, the Golden Company dispatched such threats efficiently. Aegon himself, though shielded by Cunnington's men, was no stranger to the battlefield. He had practiced on a rocking ship's deck, and now he tested his steel on the grass and mud of the Stormlands. One day, a small group of Lannister-aligned knights rode out from a local lord's keep to challenge the Targaryen host, calling them traitors and pretenders. With the arrogance of those who believed themselves unstoppable, they demanded single combat. When one brazen knight insulted both Rhaegar and Elaya's memory, Aegon stepped forward. Jon Cunnington might have prevented it, but something in Aegon's eyes stayed his hand. The young Targaryen took the field. His blade was light in his grasp, but his training had been rigorous. The knight charged, and Aegon met him with a calm deflection, letting the knight's momentum carry him past. The watchers drew breath as the knight turned, fury in his eyes. A second pass. The knight aimed a furious blow at Aegon's helm, but the boy ducked and twisted. He stepped inside the man's guard, sliding his blade against the knight's steel with a controlled grace that would have made his father proud. In a heartbeat, the edge found a gap in the knight's armor beneath the arm. The man tumbled from his saddle, bleeding into the dust. Aegon stood over him, breath coming in short gasps. The onlookers said the knight opened his mouth to beg mercy, but no words came out. He died gazing up at the boy with disbelieving eyes. Cunnington later noted that Aegon's face had grown pale. He had taken life before in smaller skirmishes, but never so directly, never with all eyes upon him. When he raised his head, however, and the horns of the Golden Company sounded, Aegon did not flinch. The realm would remember that moment as one of his first true steps into the role of a warrior king. Far away, in the Red Keep, The news that Aegon was not only advancing but inspiring local lords to join him caused tremors. Cersei's counsels grew more desperate. In response, she commanded that any lord found giving succor to the Targaryen pretender be declared a traitor. She demanded the heads of any Stormland lords who bent the knee to that boy. She pressed the alchemists to prepare more wildfire. King Tommen, young and bewildered, began to sense the fear swirling in the castle. Marjorie Tyrell tried to keep the boy calm, but she too saw how fragile the situation was. The Tyrell forces, formidable though they were, had been drained by the wars as well, and the future was uncertain. Jaime Lannister was dispatched from Riverrun at Cersei's insistence to bring whatever loyal men he still commanded. He rode for King's Landing, jaw set in grim determination, uncertain whether he was helping maintain a rightful regime or plunging the realm into deeper bloodshed. He could see the fracturing lines in the Lannister hold. Perhaps he remembered the last time Targaryens had ruled, and how that had ended with the Mad King's death at Jaime's own hand. Perhaps a part of him wondered if he would once again have to play the Kingslayer, or if this time the realm might have a different end in store. As the Targaryen host moved north, some men expected the boy to turn east toward King's Landing immediately. Yet Aegon surprised them by halting near the Rose Road for a time, consolidating alliances, sending ravens to the Lords of the Reach, even to Dorne. That was when emissaries from Dorne finally arrived to treat with him, a trio of highborn Martells, accompanied by several knights. They approached Aegon's camp with a wary air, for the Dornish had long memories of how Elia had been forsaken, how her children had been murdered. Aegon greeted them in a large tent decked in the Targaryen colors, the golden skull of a dragon's head from the Golden Company's banner displayed behind him. The Dornish emissaries were shown every courtesy. When they saw Aegon's face, with eyes that held a faint purple hue reminiscent of Targaryen lineage, with the shape of his jaw that some swore was reminiscent of Rhaegar, their stern exteriors wavered for a moment. Could it truly be Elia's son before them, alive? Prince Doran himself had not come, his health too frail, but he had sent his kin. One of them was Arianne Martell. She stood proud, dark hair tumbling over her shoulders, her eyes alight with questions. Connington, near Aegon's side, noticed how she studied the boy, and Aegon studied her in turn, with a hopeful intensity that suggested he longed for the acceptance of Elia's family. The negotiations took days. Arianne and the Martell Knights tested the boy's knowledge of Elia Martell, of Rhaegar's habits, of memories from Aegon's earliest years, though he could recall little. They questioned him about his intentions for Dorne, about how he might redress the injustices inflicted upon House Martell. In response, Aegon spoke as best he could about the life he had led under the guardianship of Varys, though he mentioned the spymaster only in hushed references, and Jon Connington, about the love he carried in his heart for his mother, Elia, though he knew her only through tales. He promised that under his reign, House Martell would be esteemed as never before, that the murder of Elia and her children would be avenged, and that Dorne would hold a place of preeminence in the realm, as repayment for the horrors inflicted upon them. Arianne's skepticism remained for a time, but there was also a stirring in her. The possibility of a Targaryen restoration that honored Dorne's suffering, a chance for justice, for the ghost of Elia to finally rest. And so, after private council, the emissaries agreed to an alliance. A royal betrothal was suggested. Some said that Arianne Martell might become this new Targaryen's queen in time. Others whispered of alternative matches. But it was enough that a bond was formed. At the news, Connington quietly exhaled. Dorne's neutrality or enmity could have spelled disaster. Their loyalty might tip the scales. From there, the campaign to King's Landing began in earnest. Scouts reported that the Lannister host gathered around the capital was formidable, though not as strong as it might have been before years of conflict. The Tyrells were not fully committed, but Mace Tyrell had sent men to support the crown as an obligation, if only to keep the Lannisters from turning on Highgarden next. Jaime Lannister had arrived with a smaller force from the Riverlands, though his men were weary from prior sieges. King's Landing itself was well defended by the walls, the city watch, and a portion of the newly revitalized Faith militant. Above all, there was the threat that wildfire had been prepared to defend the city in a desperate last resort, a legacy of Aerys that no one had forgotten. Aegon's captains conferred. Some urged caution, advocating a siege rather than an all-out assault. Others insisted that a swift strike would shock the defenders and lead to an earlier capitulation. The boy listened attentively, absorbing strategies, conferring with Connington, who had served as hand of the king under Aerys for a brief time. Ultimately, Aegon decided on a careful approach. He would encamp near the city's outskirts, cut off supply lines, and draw out the defenders to a field battle if they dared. With Dorne's support trickling in, and if the Tyrells proved unwilling to heavily commit in defense of the Lannisters, the city might be starved into submission. Yet it would take time, and time was not always a friend. Word reached Aegon that the city's stores were not as depleted as rumored. Under Kevan Lannister's guidance, the Red Keep had quietly stockpiled grain. Moreover, the presence of the Faith militant complicated matters. The High Septon had recognized Tommen as the rightful king for months, and while some of the Faith's rank and file might recall old Targaryen alliances with the Faith, the public stance was that Tommen was the anointed king. So Aegon arranged demonstrations of mercy for all who would bend the knee. He sent messages to the city, urging them to open their gates and spare their small folk the ravages of a siege. He called on them to recognize his claim, to recall that Tommen was born of incest, though it was still dangerous to say it plainly, and that the Lannisters had usurped the throne from the rightful Targaryen line. The small folk within the city, battered by the War of the Five Kings, uncertain whom to trust, listened to these proclamations with guarded hearts. Some indeed believed this was a mummer's dragon, a pretender. Others, recalling the tales of Rhaegar's gentle nature, harbored secret hopes that his son might be a kinder king. The first real test came when a force led by Randyll Tarly marched from the Reach to break the siege. Tarly was a seasoned commander, fiercely loyal to House Tyrell. If Aegon sought to blockade King's Landing, Tarly intended to smash the Targaryen forces in the field. Scouts alerted Aegon to Tarly's approach. The boy king called his banners, and the Golden Company rose in disciplined ranks, supported now by a growing number of Stormlanders, and even a sprinkling of Dornish outriders. They met Tarly west of the city, in rolling farmland that had not yet recovered from past devastation. The ensuing battle would be etched into the memory of that generation. The Golden Company, famed for its prowess, formed tight phalanxes of spears. Their archers lined the ridges, launching volleys that darkened the skies. Tarly's men were no green recruits, though, and for several hours, it looked as though they might succeed in shattering Aegon's left flank. In the midst of the swirling melee, knights and footmen screamed and died, horses toppled, banners were cut down, and the soil grew thick with blood and mud. Aegon himself, guarded by a retinue, rode among the lines, calling encouragement, stealing the hearts of men who feared that the famed Randyll Tarly might be unstoppable. When Tarly's cavalry charged, smashing into the Targaryen left, Aegon spurred his horse across the field, brandishing a sword that glinted in the late afternoon sun. The men saw him appear amid the chaos, shouting for them to hold. Connington, cursing under his breath at the risk, followed close behind with reserves. Inspired by the prince, the men on the flank rallied, regrouped, and unleashed a disciplined counterattack. The Targaryen center advanced at the same time, collapsing Tarly's right. In that swirling confusion, Tarly's men began to lose cohesion. By twilight, the Golden Company had forced Tarly's rout. Randyll Tarly, bloodied and stunned, was captured. Later, a battered Aegon Targaryen confronted Tarly, who knelt before him, hateful eyes full of reluctant submission. When Tarly refused to swear fealty, Aegon spared his life anyway and allowed him to be kept as a hostage, remarking that more blood need not be shed. It was a gesture of clemency that resonated throughout the realm. In King's Landing, the news of Tarly's defeat, combined with the swirling rumors of the Targaryen prince's mercy, threw everything into disarray. The Tyrell men still in the city fumed that their commander had been taken. The Lannisters, reeling, began to fear that if the Tyrells withdrew entirely, King's Landing would be left virtually defenseless. Kevan Lannister recognized that the city would fall if they could not turn the tide soon. He tried to broker a settlement with the Tyrells, offering expansions of privileges, gold, whatever he could muster. The Tyrells, however, began to see where the wind was blowing. They had pinned hopes on Margaery becoming queen, but if Tommen's regime was doomed, perhaps the House of the Reach should change course. Mace Tyrell wavered, desperately wanting to see his daughter remain queen, yet also reluctant to bet the future of Highgarden on an already sinking ship. A raven arrived from Highgarden to Aegon's camp, carrying a carefully worded message that proposed discreet talks. Aegon conferred with Connington. The next day, a meeting was arranged in a meadow near the city, with only a handful of attendants on both sides. The Tyrell envoys saw a young man, dusted with the grime of battle but carrying himself with a bearing that reminded them of the songs about Rhaegar. With each carefully spoken word, Aegon wove a tapestry of possibility. If House Tyrell withdrew its support from the Lannisters, if they opened their granaries to feed the besieging force, if they recognized him as the rightful king, he would confirm their extensive rights in the Reach, keep Margaery as a queen in name if Tommen would peacefully abdicate, though that was a delicate matter, or offer alternative alliances in the new regime. The Tyrells did not commit at once, but the tension was undeniable. If Aegon took King's Landing, the Tyrell men inside the walls risked annihilation. If they remained loyal to Tommen and lost anyway, they risked retribution. And they sensed that this Targaryen prince was winning hearts, not just battles. A sense of the inevitable hung over them. Back within the Red Keep, Cersei paced the halls like a caged lioness. Qyburn brought her disturbing tidings. The streets were murmuring with talk that the Targaryen boy was indeed legitimate, that he was gentle yet firm, that he spared lives when possible. The small folk, starved and battered by the years of war, were leaning toward him. The city watch might not hold if pressed too hard, and the wildfire she had prepared might prove more curse than blessing. Another rumor said that Tyrion Lannister, once escaped from King's Landing, had had a hand in supporting this Targaryen across the sea. The thought of her hated brother's cunning turning the tide made Cersei seethe with a murderous wrath. Jaime Lannister, returning to the city's walls, saw the massed banners of the Golden Company encircling them. The starved farmland beyond was dotted with tents. Never had he seen such an orderly siege. From the ramparts, Jaime glimpsed a silver-haired youth on a warhorse. Memories of Rhaegar came unbidden. Jaime recalled the day he knelt before the King's Guard, the day Rhaegar had greeted him with kindness. For a moment, he almost believed it was Rhaegar reborn. Then reality intruded, and Jaime heard the fearful talk of the city's defenders. Jaime confronted Cersei in a private chamber that reeked of wine and candle smoke, urging her to see reason, to negotiate. She refused, spitting at him accusations of betrayal. She demanded that as Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, he protect Tommen, even if it meant burning the city to cinders. Jaime's face hardened, and he said quietly that he had once been commanded to burn the city and had done what he must to prevent it. He would not see King's Landing drowned in wildfire again. This led to a fierce argument. Ugly words were exchanged. Jaime left the chamber with a face like stone, refusing to echo the old vow that had cost him his honor once. Days passed. The ring around King's Landing tightened. The Targaryen host cut off supplies, though not as severely as many thought they might. Aegon believed that starving the common folk would only breed resentment, so he allowed limited shipments of bread to pass through, to show his compassion. This dual approach, showing strength but also mercy, made more lords in the Crownlands question their fealty. Gradually, some Crownland houses opened their gates to Targaryen riders, providing intelligence. A few even marched to join Aegon. Finally, as the standoff stretched into weeks, Aegon resolved to deliver a final ultimatum. He rode with Connington and a retinue under a peace banner to the city gates, requesting an audience with the King's Hand, or whomever spoke for Tommen. Jaime Lannister came forth, accompanied by a line of knights and gold cloaks. The two faced each other across a short expanse. Jaime was clad in gleaming armor, golden hand shining in the sunlight. Aegon wore a silver breastplate with a triple-headed dragon emblazoned on the front. The Watchers said that in that moment, it was as if Rhaegar stood before Tywin Lannister's son again, though time had weathered Jaime's features and changed the lines of his face. Jaime spoke first. "The realm does not need more bloodshed. Tommen Baratheon is the rightful king, anointed by the High Septon. If you depart now, you may keep your life." Aegon's voice, when he replied, was steady. "I am Aegon Targaryen, son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Elia Martell, rightful heir to the Iron Throne. I will not depart. I mean to spare the city if I can. Let Tommen and his mother lay down their crowns, and no harm will come to them. The Lannisters may keep their titles and lands, but the Iron Throne is mine by right." Jaime studied him a long moment, as though looking for signs of falsehood. When he finally spoke, his voice was subdued. "The city remembers the last Targaryen who sat the throne. Men still call me Kingslayer for what I did to him. I will not let the city burn again. Nor will I," Aegon promised. "I have come to save it." They parted without a resolution. Yet that night, Kevan Lannister and Pycelle's replacement as Grand Maester, a timid man named Orwyle, pressed the small council to consider surrender. The Tyrell envoys were quietly leaving the city, and men whispered that they might open a gate if it came to open assault. The Gold Cloaks, once fiercely loyal to the Lannisters, were rumored to be dividing in their loyalties, for the Lannister coin was nearly spent, and Aegon's promise of mercy was tempting. Cersei refused to hear such talk. She raged. She threatened to burn them all with wildfire, as Aerys had once threatened. When Kevan tried to reason with her, she slapped him. When Jaime begged her to see sense, she screamed that he was no true brother, that he had forsaken her, that he wanted to give the throne to the spawn of Rhaegar. The tension in the halls of the Red Keep reached a fever pitch. Tommen, a child king, grew pale and frightened, clinging to Ser Pounce and to Marjorie's comforting words. The Tyrell girl, however, saw that if she did not get Tommen away from Cersei, both might perish in the coming storm. Events came to a head when a portion of the City Watch simply refused to enforce the Queen Regent's orders to arrest suspected Targaryen sympathizers. Fearing an uprising within the walls, Kevan Lannister took the lead. He brokered a secret meeting with Aegon's representatives, offering terms of surrender if the boy could guarantee the safety of House Lannister, Tommen, and even Cersei. After much debate, Aegon agreed, though with conditions. Tommen would formally renounce the throne, House Lannister would kneel in fealty to the new Targaryen king, and they would hand over the keys to the city. Jaime Lannister was complicit in this, seeing no other way to save the city and the lives of his nephew and sister. In the pre-dawn hours, the gates of King's Landing opened from within. The Gold Cloaks who sided with Kevan and Jaime admitted the Golden Company and Stormlander Knights who marched in well-organized columns. King's Landing did not awake to the sound of sacking, but rather a disciplined occupation. Cersei, upon hearing of the betrayal, tried to rally what remained of her loyal men. Qyburn had a hidden cache of wildfire that might yet wreak havoc. But it was too late. Jaime himself arrived in her chambers with a contingent of knights. He took the vile green substance from Qyburn's table and had his men secure the Alchemist's Guild. Cersei shrieked in fury, spitting curses at her brother, calling him Kingslayer and betrayer. Jaime, haunted, stared at her a long moment. "You were always my weakness," he said softly. "But I will not see the city burn. Tommen will live. You will live. But you must yield." Then the door burst open and men of the Golden Company entered, swords drawn. Cersei's face twisted, but when she saw their numbers, she realized the hopelessness. She spat at them, refusing to kneel even as her own men laid down arms. She was forcibly escorted to the throne room, where Kevan, Marjorie, and other courtiers had gathered under the watchful gaze of Targaryen banners. By the time dawn's rays shone through the high windows, Aegon Targaryen entered the Red Keep through the massive doors, flanked by Jon Connington and captains of the Golden Company. He was dusty from riding, but he held his head high. For the first time since Robert's rebellion, a Targaryen had come to claim the Iron Throne. The watchers in the throne room murmured and shifted. Members of the small council bowed. Even some Lannister men knelt, though they did so with grim faces. Jaime Lannister stood off to one side, arms folded with a haunted look. Kevin Lannister sank to one knee, his voice tremulous as he intoned, "I, Kevin Lannister, Castellan of the Red Keep, hand of the king to King Tommen, do surrender this castle and the city to your grace, Aegon of House Targaryen." Cersei refused to kneel until the Golden Company forced her down, her beautiful face contorted with rage and humiliation. Little Tommen, tears streaming down his cheeks, stood near Marjorie. The boy was scarcely old enough to understand it all, but at Kevin's prompting, Tommen removed his golden crown and handed it to Aegon's men. Marjorie gently supported him, trembling at what might come next. A silence settled. The Iron Throne loomed behind them. Aegon studied it, that mass of twisted swords hammered together by the fires of Balerion the Black Dread centuries past. It was a seat steeped in blood and history. His ancestors had forged it, and yet so much suffering had been wrought around it. Slowly, deliberately, he ascended the steps, mindful that many a king had cut himself on those jagged edges. When he reached the top, he turned to face the hall, the hush broken only by the distant crow of a gull. Connington approached with the boy's personal standard, a Targaryen banner with the red three-headed dragon. In a resonant voice, Jon Connington proclaimed, "Behold Aegon Targaryen, sixth of his name, King of the Undulls, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms, Protector of the Realm." There was an intake of breath. Kneeling men bowed deeper. More men, seeing the tide, scrambled to lower themselves. Tommen sniffled, pressed close to Marjorie. Kevin closed his eyes in resignation. Cersei's face was pale, defiant. Jaime simply watched. Aegon did not appear triumphant in that moment, nor did he gloat. He looked out across the throne room, a swirl of emotions playing across his face. At last he spoke. "I accept your surrender," he said. "Tommen Baratheon is a child. He bears no blame for the sins of his mother or his grandfather. He shall be treated with respect, and I will see him cared for. The same promise I extend even to Cersei Lannister, though she may face the judgment of the crown for crimes committed under her regency." Cersei gave a strangled cry, but Jaime took her arm, warning her with his eyes to be silent. In the hush, the new king continued, "The wars that have ravaged the land must come to an end. I mean to heal these wounds. Those who would stand with me shall find forgiveness. Those who seek to sow further chaos shall be dealt with." Few in the hall missed that final statement, which might well be aimed at those Lannisters who refused to kneel. With that, the bells of King's Landing began to toll, announcing that a new king now sat upon the Iron Throne. Word spread through the city like a torrent. Some cheered, for they were tired of the Lannisters. Others were uncertain, for this was still a Targaryen, and Targaryens had not always been benevolent. But the city did not burn. The city did not fall to rapine and pillage. Instead, the Golden Company took up positions. The city watch largely stood down or joined them, and the small folk carried on, albeit anxiously. Within hours, riders were dispatched across the realm, announcing the ascension of Aegon Targaryen. Maesters read out the official proclamations. Some lords rose up in revolt, refusing to recognize him, but they were fewer than expected. Many, weary of war, decided that the realm needed a king. If Aegon could bring peace, if he truly was Rhaegar's son, they would pay him fealty. Over the next fortnight, the new regime began to take shape. Aegon named Jon Connington as his hand, restoring the once disgraced lord to the station he had held so many years before, but under far different circumstances. To maintain stability, he offered Kevin Lannister a seat on the council, urging him to help transition the city's bureaucracy. Kevin, cautious but pragmatic, accepted. Marjorie Tyrell was granted permission to return to Highgarden or to remain as a guest at court. In a surprising move of magnanimity, Aegon did not hold her alliance with Tommen against her. She chose to remain for the time being, caring for Tommen, who found himself a boy of uncertain title, no longer king. The faith militant, uncertain how to respond, eventually sent an envoy to see whether Aegon would reaffirm the faith's privileges. The new king did not yield as wholeheartedly as Tommen had, but he sought not to antagonize them. Cersei was formally charged with a litany of crimes. Regicide for the death of King Robert, although evidence was scant, conspiracy, adultery, and the murder of her friend and confidant, among others. Many suspected Qyburn had done monstrous things in her name. She was confined to a tower cell, awaiting a trial. Jaime's position remained ambiguous. Once Lord Commander of Tommen's Kingsguard, he now found himself in the uneasy position of continuing as a Kingsguard under Aegon or forsaking vows to stand by his sister's side. The realm watched with bated breath to see if the famed Kingslayer would slay yet another king. Jaime's loyalties were conflicted. His first impulse was to remain with Tommen, but Tommen was no longer king. Jaime had never truly believed in the Lannister claim to the throne. He had done his duty as best he could. Now, if Aegon truly intended to be a just king, perhaps Jaime could finally serve a ruler without shame. And so, in a private audience, Jaime bent the knee to Aegon. The new king accepted his fealty, though his violet eyes held a measure of caution. "Stand, Ser Jaime," he said softly. "We shall see if we can both be better men than the ghosts that haunt this throne." And so, for the time, the Lannister hold on King's Landing ended without a bloody purge. Some small folk praised the new Targaryen for his mercy. Others expected him to show the savage side of House Targaryen eventually. But for the moment, a fragile peace took root in the Crownlands. Aegon turned his attention to the rest of Westeros. The north was torn by struggles between the Boltons and the remnants of Stark loyalists. The Vale stood aloof under Lord Robert Arryn and the cunning Peter Baelish. The Riverlands still reeled from the aftermath of the Frey betrayals. The Iron Islands continued their raids. Aegon knew that to secure the realm, he would need to bring each region into the fold. Some said that Daenerys Targaryen yet lived across the sea, gathering her own power. But for now, at least, King's Landing was his. In the weeks that followed, the city lowly adjusted to Targaryen rule. Aegon made a point of showing himself to the small folk. He walked the markets with guards, hearing grievances. He inspected the city's defenses to ensure no cataclysmic wildfire caches remained hidden. He convened councils in the Red Keep Solar, calling upon lords to help restore trade routes and fix the damaged roads. The Iron Throne was his seat, but he spent more time pacing with Connington, discussing governance, than lounging in regal splendor. Diplomats from Dorne arrived, among them Prince Trystane Martell, who brought formal congratulations from Prince Doran. Trystane also carried an offer, a union between the Targaryen king and a Martell bride, sealing the alliance they had begun in the field. Aegon received him warmly, though he kept his own counsel. Many whispered that Arianne Martell might soon arrive in King's Landing, and that a royal wedding could unify the realm in a grand gesture of reconciliation with Dorne. The Tyrells, for their part, had to accept that Margaery's second husband was no longer a king. Mace Tyrell, ever anxious about his standing, sent a lavish gift to Aegon, praising the new king's wise governance. In return, Aegon promised favorable trade privileges for the Reach, hoping to re-establish stability. The Tyrell guards in King's Landing gradually left, replaced by Targaryen loyalists. Amid these diplomatic victories, the matter of justice loomed. Cersei Lannister's trial approached. The realm debated whether the new king would have her beheaded, made a hostage, or cast into exile. When the day of the trial arrived, the throne room was crowded with courtiers, lords, and ladies, as well as a throng of small folk admitted to witness the downfall of the once regent. Cersei, wearing a simple gray gown, entered in chains. Her face was pale, etched with fury and fear. Jaime stood near the dais, his head lowered, uncertain if he could watch. Tommen, seated in a place of honor but no longer wearing a crown, clung to Margaery's hand. Charges were read out. Evidence was presented. Witnesses included Pycelle's old records, statements from Lancel Lannister, confessions extracted by the Faith. Qyburn, half-mad, attempted to defend his mistress, but his words did more harm than good. Cersei was given leave to speak. In a harsh, shaking voice, she insisted that all was done for the good of her children. She spat at the court, calling them fools for believing in the Targaryen boys' so-called mercy. But as she raved, her words turned desperate. She accused Marjorie of seducing Tommen, of plotting with the Tyrells to overthrow her. She railed at Kevan for betraying the family. Finally, the new king raised a hand. Silence fell. In a measured tone, Aegon pronounced her guilty of regicide in Robert Baratheon's suspicious death, of high treason against the rightful Targaryen heir, and of atrocities committed by enabling Qyburn's horrors. The crowd stirred. Jaime looked stricken, and then came the sentence. Not death, but life imprisonment in the Silent Sisters' charge, forced to spend her days in penance for the rest of her life, denied the ability to speak or command, a living condemnation. The hall erupted in murmurs. Some cried out that it was too lenient. Others seemed relieved that blood would not further stain the floor. Cersei herself looked as though she'd been struck by a warhammer. She sank to her knees, shoulders trembling in outrage and grief. Jaime turned away, agony etched in his face, as the Silent Sisters came forward to take her. In that moment, he realized the sister he had once loved was truly lost to him. He felt an echo of the day he had killed the Mad King, saving the city but dooming his honor. Now he had saved the city again, in a way, but lost what remained of his family. With Cersei confined, and Tommen placed under the wardship of Kevan Lannister at Casterly Rock, peace settled more securely over King's Landing. The small folk, initially wary, began to call Aegon the dragon who brought dawn, a reference to the fresh start he seemed to promise after endless nights of war. Others called him Aegon the Merciful, though none knew whether that mercy would extend indefinitely. In the following months, Aegon sent out royal decrees, calling upon all the great lords to attend a grand council in King's Landing, where they would recognize him and present their grievances. The lords of the Stormlands came readily, for many had already supported him. The Crownlands, with no reason to champion the Lannisters, bent the knee. Dorne, through Prince Doran, sent official envoys, and talk of a royal marriage was reaffirmed. The Westerlands were in disarray. Though Kevan attempted to bring them to heel, many lesser lords resented that House Lannister had lost power. Still, they grudgingly recognized Aegon, if only to avoid yet another war. The Reach, bound partly by Marjorie's uncertain position and partly by trade necessity, also complied. The North remained the thorniest problem. News trickled south that the Boltons claimed to have married a girl they said was Arya Stark, and so the North was nominally under Bolton rule, though many suspected the Starks had not vanished so easily. Aegon weighed his options. Some counselors suggested he let the North remain a frozen battleground until they sorted themselves out. Others recommended forging alliances with houses historically loyal to the Targaryens, or possibly sending a royal army to quell the Boltons. But such a campaign would be costly, and winter threatened. For the time being, Aegon refrained, focusing on solidifying his position in the south. The Ironborn also posed a threat, as their raids continued. Aegon's council considered sending a fleet to punish them, but the royal coffers were still recovering. Under Kevan Lannister's watchful oversight, taxes were restructured, while the city was stabilized. The king gave the small folk modest but symbolic relief measures, reductions in certain tolls, restoration of services to war-torn areas. Step by step, he sought to show that the Targaryen name need not be synonymous with tyranny or madness. Word spread across the sea that Daenerys Targaryen was indeed alive, that she had sacked cities in Slaver's Bay and might someday return to Westeros. Some asked how this new king would react to the possibility of another Targaryen claiming the throne. But for now, she was far off, and no new tidings indicated her arrival was imminent. Aegon heard the rumors with interest, wondering if this aunt he had never met might be an ally or a rival. In King's Landing, a new normal emerged. The black and red banners of House Targaryen were raised over the Red Keep. People went about their lives, relieved that the war had not entered another brutal phase. Courtly intrigues did not vanish, but the tone had changed. Where Cersei's court had been a nest of fear and manipulation, Aegon's seemed to promise possibility. The king often walked among the people, accompanied by a small retinue, hearing concerns, granting alms, listening. He had been raised partly at sea, partly on the march with soldiers, so the closeness to his people felt natural to him. It was not all goodwill. Many Lannister loyalists remained resentful, speaking privately of the boy's questionable heritage. Some Stormlanders muttered that he was too green, too soft. In time, all would test him, to see if he truly possessed the metal to hold the realm together. Beyond the walls, petty conflicts smoldered. The remains of the Freys in the Riverlands, the roving remnants of other defeated factions, and the chaos in the north all loomed. But for the moment, the Iron Throne had a Targaryen seated upon it once again, and that single fact reverberated across Westeros. Once the Great Council convened, bringing together an assembly of lords, maesters, knights, and ladies in King's Landing. Aegon rose in the throne room to address them. He spoke of forging a lasting peace, of uniting the Seven Kingdoms as Aegon the Conqueror had, but this time without the terror of dragonfire. He lauded the memory of Rhaegar, the father he never knew, promising to embody the best of that noble prince. He acknowledged the realm's scars, those inflicted by his own grandfather, Aerys, and those inflicted by Robert's rebellion. "No house is blameless," he declared, "but we can choose a better path. Let it begin here." A hush fell. Some lords glanced at each other, uncertain if such lofty words could be believed. Others found themselves inspired, remembering the songs of Rhaegar's harp, the gentle manner that had once promised a different kind of Targaryen rule. It was in that hush that Arianne Martell finally arrived, leading a grand Dornish retinue. She wore a flowing gown of deep orange and red, the sun and spear of House Martell prominent on her banners. When she entered the throne room, her eyes went first to Aegon on the Iron Throne. For a moment, the two regarded each other as though recalling the conversations in the Stormlands, the caution, the hope. Then, in a swift gesture, Arianne knelt. "Dorne recognizes the king in the capital," she said. There was a ripple of excitement. Days later, the news spread that a betrothal had been formalized between Aegon Targaryen and Arianne Martell. The banquet that night was a lavish one, paid for partly by the Martell coffers, partly by the crown's new funds, though it was nowhere near as extravagant as the feasts of old Targaryen kings. Wine flowed, lords made toasts, and the city glowed with torchlight. The people in the streets might not have been invited, but they could see fireworks lighting the night sky, courtesy of the pyromancers, repurposing their talents for celebration instead of destruction. Aegon, newly betrothed, seemed both exhilarated and anxious. He knew that forging alliances was only the beginning. Ruling would be the real challenge. The memory of his father's downfall and the entire Targaryen dynasty's collapse hung over him. At the banquet's high table, he spoke quietly with Arianne. She teased him a bit, telling him that she expected Dorne's rightful place in the realm. He, in turn, promised to treat Dorne with honor. Their words were full of careful courtesy, but there was a spark of real curiosity between them. Perhaps something genuine could blossom. Below, the assembled lords and ladies watched with interest. Marjorie Tyrell, seated with Tommen, sipped her wine, reflecting that this Targaryen king might be the best hope of stability for the realm, and for her own prospects. Ser Jaime lingered near a pillar, face unreadable, while Kevin Lannister conversed with Jon Connington about matters of state. The world had turned upside down in a matter of months, and already men adapted to the new reality. As the feast progressed, a bard was called forth. He sang a song of dragons in the sky, a tune reminiscent of the old Targaryen ballads. The hall grew still, remembering the ancient days. Then, unexpectedly, the bard shifted to a gentler melody, a piece once attributed to Rhaegar Targaryen himself. It spoke of summer nights, of lost chances, of hope. The tune echoed among the rafters, bringing tears to some eyes. Aegon listened, trying to imagine his father composing such a song, perhaps with a silver harp in his hands. In that moment, the boy king felt both the weight of history and the flicker of promise. He had reclaimed the throne lost to his family. He had ended the Lannister hold. But he was no conqueror astride a dragon. He was a child of war, forging peace with the best allies he could manage. If he could keep the realm from fracturing once more, perhaps all the sacrifice would be worth it. Even as the final notes faded, Aegon knew that much work lay ahead. The North, the Ironborn, the uncertain machinations of Peter Baelish in the Vale, the mysteries lurking across the narrow sea. Those challenges would not disappear simply because a Targaryen once more wore the crown. But for one night, at least, there was music instead of screams, feasting instead of slaughter, and the promise of a king who might be both strong and merciful. Thus did Aegon Targaryen, if he truly was the son of Rhaegar and Elia, begin his reign. The city breathed out a sigh of relief at being spared yet another sack. The realm looked on, judging whether this new Targaryen was but another prelude to madness or a genuine restoration of what some called a golden age. In the candlelit halls and among the crowded alleyways, people whispered, "Long live the king! May he be just, may he be wise." Some believed the realm's wounds could be healed under his hand. Others harbored suspicions that a dragon always has claws. But for now, at least, the Iron Throne felt a rightful occupant's weight, and House Targaryen was no longer just a memory in the dusty pages of a maester's tome. They had returned, and the Seven Kingdoms would never be the same.